The transport ship shuddered as it broke through the atmospheric barrier of Zentara Prime, and Kyle Morrison felt his stomach twist into knots that had nothing to do with the turbulence. He sat alone in the detention compartment with magnetic restraints, holding his wrist to the cold metal bench beneath him, and two alien guards standing at attention near the sealed doorway. The guards were Zentaran females, and they watched him with those unsettling violet eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim lighting of the ship. Kyle had been a soldier for 8 years, and he had seen combat on 4 different worlds, but nothing in his military training had prepared him for what happened 3 weeks ago when his reconnaissance team stumbled into the Zentaran settlement. The mission was supposed to be simple and straightforward, but everything went wrong when they encountered the alien patrol. His squad leader, Lieutenant Danny Pierce, had ordered them to fall back, but the Zentarans were faster than any human, and they surrounded the team within minutes. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes before Kyle and his teammates were subdued and taken into custody. That was when he learned something that military intelligence had somehow failed to mention in their briefings about the Zentaran species. Their entire government and military command structure was controlled exclusively by females. Males existed in their society, but they held no positions of authority or power whatsoever. The Zentaran females were taller than human women, standing at an average height of 6.5 feet, with lean, muscular builds and skin that ranged from pale silver to deep purple depending on their regional ancestry. They had facial features that were almost human, except for the slightly larger eyes and the delicate ridges that ran along their cheekbones and down their necks. Their hair grew in shades of white silver and platinum, and most of them wore it long and braided in intricate patterns that signified their rank and family lineage. Kyle was 27 years old with dark brown hair and hazel eyes, and he stood at exactly 6 feet tall, which made him shorter than most of the Zentaran females he had encountered. He had a lean, athletic build from years of military conditioning and a few scars on his arms and torso from previous combat deployments. The ship began its final descent toward the capital city, and Kyle could see the sprawling metropolis through the narrow viewport across. From his bench, Zentara Prime was a beautiful world with 3 moons and vast oceans that sparkled like liquid silver under the light of their yellow sun. The cities were built with towering spires of crystalline material that reflected and refracted light in spectacular displays of color. The transport touched down on a landing platform attached to what Kyle assumed was some kind of government building, and the magnetic restraints on his wrists released with a soft click. One of the guards gestured for him to stand, and he complied slowly while keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. They led him through a series of corridors filled with Zentaran females who stopped their conversations to stare at him as he passed. He was apparently quite the curiosity here, and he could hear them whispering to each other in their melodic language. Kyle had learned a few basic phrases during his captivity, but he was far from fluent. The guards brought him into a large circular chamber with high ceilings and walls made of that same crystalline material that seemed to be the primary building component of Zentaran architecture. At the center of the chamber was a raised platform with 7 ornate chairs arranged in a semicircle. 6 of those chairs were already occupied by Zentaran females wearing long flowing robes in various shades of blue and purple. These were clearly individuals of significant importance and authority. The 7th chair remained empty. Kyle was directed to stand on a circular platform in the center of the chamber facing the tribunal. His guards took positions on either side of him, but made no move to restrain him further. A door opened on the far side of the chamber, and another Zentaran female entered. She was stunning even by the standards of her already impressive species. She stood at least 7 feet tall with pale silver skin and hair so white it seemed to glow with its own internal light. Her eyes were the deepest shade of violet Kyle had ever seen, and they fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to look away. She wore robes of deep midnight blue embroidered with silver thread in patterns that seemed to shift and flow as she moved. This was clearly the leader of the tribunal, and she took her seat in the 7th chair with graceful precision. When she spoke, her voice carried throughout the chamber without any need for amplification. The language was Zentaran, but Kyle recognized enough words to understand that she was opening the proceedings. One of the guards touched a device on her belt, and suddenly Kyle could understand everything being said. The translation technology was far more advanced than anything humanity had developed. The tribunal leader, whose name was announced as High Magistrate Lyanna of House Silvermoon, looked directly at Kyle and began speaking in flawless English. She told him that he and his squad had violated Zentaran territorial sovereignty and had engaged in hostile military action against Zentaran citizens. The charges were serious and under normal circumstances would result in immediate execution. Kyle felt his heart rate spike, but he forced himself to remain calm and composed. Lyanna continued explaining that, however, the Zentaran Council had been engaged in diplomatic negotiations with human authorities for the past 2 weeks. An agreement had been reached that would spare the lives of Kyle and his teammates in exchange for certain concessions and commitments from the human government. Kyle's squad mates had already been transported back to human space, but his case was different. He was being retained here on Zentara Prime for what Lyanna described as a matter of significant cultural importance. Another member of the tribunal spoke up. Her name was Counselor Vera, and she appeared to be slightly older than Lyanna, with silver hair that had hints of darker gray threaded through it. Vera explained that Zentaran society was facing a crisis. Their population had been declining steadily for the past 3 generations due to a combination of factors, including a genetic condition that affected their ability to reproduce successfully. The condition primarily impacted male Zentarans and resulted in a dramatically reduced fertility rate. This had led to a situation where there were now 5 Zentaran females for every male in their society. The few males who were fertile were heavily regulated by the government, and their reproductive activities were strictly controlled and scheduled. This system had been in place for over a century, but it was clearly not sustainable in the long term. The Zentaran scientific community had been researching potential solutions for decades, and they had recently made a breakthrough discovery. Humans were genetically compatible with Zentarans to a degree that no other known species had achieved. While natural reproduction between the 2 species was not possible without medical intervention, the Zentaran scientists had developed procedures that could facilitate successful pregnancies. This was where Kyle's situation became complicated. The tribunal had decided that he would serve as a test subject for their new reproduction program. He would be required to mate with multiple Zentaran females who had recently reached reproductive maturity. These females had volunteered for the program knowing that they would be the first of their kind to attempt reproduction with a human partner. Kyle felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. Opened his mouth to protest, but Lyanna raised one elegant hand and silence fell over the chamber. She told him that he had 3 options. He could agree to participate in the program and fulfill his obligations to the tribunal. He could refuse and be executed immediately for his crimes against the Zentaran state, or he could request trial by combat, which would pit him against a Zentaran warrior of the tribunal's choosing. In a fight to the death, Kyle's mind raced as he tried to process what he was being told. The idea of being forced into intimate relations with alien females was disturbing on multiple levels, but execution was obviously not an option he wanted to pursue, and trial by combat against a species that was physically superior to humans in almost every measurable way seemed like a slow and painful form of suicide. He asked how many females he would be expected to mate with, and Lyanna's expression remained neutral as she replied, 23 females had volunteered for the first phase of the program. All of them had reached reproductive maturity within the past year, which made them between 18 and 19 years old, by human standards. Kyle felt sick. He asked what would happen to him after he fulfilled these obligations. Lyanna explained that if the program was successful and resulted in viable pregnancies, he would be granted freedom and allowed to return to human space with full diplomatic immunity. If the program failed, he would remain on Zentara Prime as a permanent resident and would be required to participate in future reproduction attempts as the scientists refined their procedures. The tribunal would reconvene in 3 days to hear his decision. Until then, he would be housed in comfortable quarters within the government complex and would be allowed limited freedom of movement under guard supervision. Kyle was escorted from the chamber in a daze. His mind kept circling back to the impossible choice he had been given. The quarters they took him to were surprisingly luxurious with a large sleeping area, a private bathroom and a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the capital city. There was a food preparation area stocked with supplies, and he noticed that someone had made an effort to include items that would be familiar to a human palate. His guards informed him that he could request anything he needed through the communication panel on the wall, and that someone would respond within minutes. Then they left him alone. Kyle stood at the windows for a long time, watching the 3 moons rise over the crystalline spires of the city. He thought about his family back on Earth. His parents still lived in the small town in Colorado, where he had grown up, and his younger sister was finishing her degree in engineering at a university in California. They had no idea where he was or what had happened to him. The military had probably told them that he was missing in action or killed in combat. He wondered if he would ever see them again. The next morning, Kyle woke to find a Zentaran female standing in his sitting room. She was younger than the Tribunal members he had met, with pale lavender skin and silver hair that fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore simple clothing in shades of gray and white, and she carried a data tablet in her hands. Her name was Kira, and she introduced herself as a cultural liaison assigned to help him understand Zentaran customs and society. Over the next 2 days, Kira became Kyle's primary source of information about the world he now found himself trapped in. She explained that Zentaran females reached physical maturity around age 17, but were not considered adults in their society until they turned 18 and completed a series of educational and cultural milestones. The females who had volunteered for the reproduction program were all between 18 and 19 years old. They came from various social classes and regions of DEATHWORLD, but they all shared a common desire to contribute to the survival of their species. Kira told him that these females understood that mating with a human would be different from anything they had been taught to expect. Zentaran reproduction was typically a formal and somewhat clinical process due to the scarcity of fertile males. There was little room for romance or personal connection in their traditional mating practices. The females in the program had been told that humans approached reproduction differently, with more emphasis on emotional and physical connection between partners. Kira seemed genuinely curious about human attitudes toward relationships and reproduction. She asked Kyle many questions about human courtship customs and dating practices. He found himself opening up to her more than he had expected. On the evening of the second day, Kira told him something that changed his perspective on the entire situation. She confessed that she was one of the 23 volunteers. She had been assigned as his cultural liaison specifically because the Tribunal wanted him to have positive interactions with at least one of the females he would potentially be mating with. Kyle stared at her in shock. Kira was beautiful by any standard human or Zentaran, and she had been kind and patient with him during their time together. But the idea that their interactions had been orchestrated by the Tribunal made him feel manipulated and angry. Kira seemed to sense his reaction, and she quickly explained that her assignment as his liaison had been the Tribunal's decision, but her choice to volunteer for the program had been entirely her own. She told him that she had lost both of her parents to the genetic condition that plagued Zentaran males, and she was determined to find a way to ensure that future generations would not face the same fate. The next morning, Kyle was summoned back to the Tribunal chamber. Liana and the other council members sat in their chairs looking down at him with expressions that revealed nothing. Liana asked for his decision. Kyle took a deep breath and told them that he would agree to participate in the program on several conditions. First, he wanted guarantees in writing that he would be allowed to return to human space once his obligations were fulfilled, regardless of whether the program succeeded or failed. Second, he wanted regular communication with his family to let them know he was alive. Third, he wanted the right to refuse any specific female who made him uncomfortable. And fourth, he wanted assurances that all females in the program were participating voluntarily and understood exactly what they were agreeing to. The Tribunal members conferred among themselves in quiet voices. After several minutes, Liana announced that they would agree to his first 2 conditions. His third request was denied because allowing him to refuse specific females would undermine the scientific validity of the program. However, they agreed to his 4th condition and stated that all volunteers had been thoroughly educated about the program and had signed formal consent documents. Kyle felt a hollow victory in getting even those limited concessions. Lyanna told him that the program would begin in 3 days. He would be moved to a private, residential facility designed specifically for the program. The facility would house him and the volunteer females in separate but connected living spaces. Each female would spend approximately 1 week with him in a shared living area designed to facilitate bonding and eventual mating. The medical team would monitor all participants throughout the process and would intervene only if health or safety concerns arose. Kyle was given access to educational materials about Zentaran biology and reproduction. He spent the next 3 days studying and trying to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. The information was overwhelming. Zentaran females had reproductive cycles that lasted approximately 40 days. They were only fertile during a 3-day window in the middle of each cycle. The medical team would be carefully tracking each volunteer's cycle to optimize the timing of each pairing. The facility they moved him to was located in a quieter district of the capital city. It was a low sprawling building surrounded by gardens filled with plants native to DEATHWORLD. The architecture was more organic here, with curved walls and rounded doorways, instead of the harsh angles of the government complex. Kyle's living quarters were spacious and comfortable, with a large bedroom, a sitting area, a full bathroom, and a small kitchen. There was a door on one wall that led to what would be the shared living space, where he would spend time with each volunteer. The first volunteer arrived the following morning. Her name was Zara, and she was 19 years old with deep purple skin and platinum blonde hair. She was nervous, and that made Kyle feel slightly better about his own anxiety. They spent the first day mostly talking. Zara told him about her life growing up in a coastal city on the far side of DEATHWORLD. She had 3 sisters and no brothers, which was typical for Zentaran families. She worked as an artist, specializing in a form of light sculpture that was unique to her people. Kyle told her about Earth and about growing up in the mountains of Colorado. He described snow to her because DEATHWORLD's climate was too warm to produce frozen precipitation. Zara was fascinated by the concept and made him promise to show her images of snow-covered mountains. On the 3rd day, they began to explore physical intimacy. The process was awkward and uncertain for both of them. Zentaran anatomy was similar enough to human that the basics were familiar, but there were subtle differences that required patience and communication. Zara was gentle and understanding, and Kyle found himself genuinely caring about her comfort and pleasure. By the end of the week, they had successfully mated multiple times. The medical team confirmed that Zara's fertile window had aligned with their time together, and there was a possibility of conception. Zara left with tears in her eyes, and Kyle felt an unexpected sadness at her departure. The second volunteer arrived the next day. Her name was Nyla, and she could not have been more different from Zara. Nyla was tall even by Zentaran standards, standing nearly 7.5 feet. She had pale silver skin and eyes so light they appeared almost white. She was confident and direct, in a way that initially intimidated Kyle, but he quickly learned that her boldness covered a deep vulnerability. Nyla's younger brother had died from complications related to the genetic condition when she was 15. She blamed herself for not being able to save him, even though there was nothing she could have done. The program represented her chance to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Kyle and Nyla's week together was intense and passionate. There was a chemistry between them that surprised both of them. When Nyla left, Kyle found himself thinking about her for days afterward. The weeks began to blur together. Each new volunteer brought her own personality, hopes, and fears. There was Lena, who was shy and soft-spoken but incredibly intelligent. She spent hours explaining Zentaran history and culture to Kyle. There was Mira, who had a wicked sense of humor and made Kyle laugh more than he had in months. There was Talia, who loved music and taught Kyle traditional Zentaran songs. Each woman was unique, and each week brought new challenges and rewards. Kyle found himself forming genuine connections with many of the volunteers. Some weeks were easier than others. There were volunteers who struggled with the intimacy required. By the program, Kyle did his best to be patient and understanding. But there were moments when the weight of the situation threatened to crush him. He was not a machine, and the emotional toll of forming these brief, intense relationships only to have Them end after 7 days was exhausting. Kira was the 15th volunteer. When she arrived, Kyle felt a flood of relief and familiarity. They had built a foundation of trust during those first days when she served as his cultural liaison. Their week together was different from all the others there. Was an ease between them that came from already knowing each other. They spent long hours talking about everything and nothing. Kira told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher and helping young Zentarans understand the importance of their cultural heritage. Kyle told her about his plans for after the program ended, assuming he survived it. He wanted to go home and see his family. He wanted to sleep in his own bed and eat food that did not come from an alien food synthesizer. He wanted his life back. On their last night together, Kira asked him if he regretted agreeing to the program. Kyle thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told her that he regretted the circumstances that had led him here. He regretted that he had been given no real choice in the matter, but he did not regret the connections he had made with her and the other volunteers. He did not regret learning about Zentaran culture and society, and he did not regret the possibility that he might be helping to save an entire species from extinction. Kira kissed him gently and told him that she would never forget him. The remaining 8 volunteers came and went in a succession of faces and names and brief moments of connection. By the time the 23rd volunteer left, Kyle felt hollowed out and exhausted. He had given everything he had to the program and he had no idea if any of it had mattered. The medical team informed him that several of the volunteers were showing early signs of pregnancy, but it would be weeks before they could confirm whether the pregnancies were viable. Kyle was moved back to his original quarters in the government complex. He spent his days staring out the windows at the alien city and wondering what would happen next. 3 months after the program ended, Lyanna summoned him to a private meeting. She looked tired, but there was a light in her violet eyes that had not been there before. She told him that 9 of the 23 volunteers were confirmed pregnant, all 9. Pregnancies appeared to be developing normally with no signs of complications. The Zentaran medical community was calling it a miracle. Kyle felt a strange mix of emotions: pride that he had succeeded in what the Tribunal had asked of him, fear for the children who would be born from this program, sadness that he would never know them, or the women who carried them. Lyanna told him that he had fulfilled his obligations to the Tribunal. He would be returned to human space as promised. A diplomatic transport was already being prepared for his journey. Kyle asked if he would ever be allowed to return to Zentara. Prime Lyanna's expression softened slightly. She told him that the decision would ultimately be up to him. If he chose to return, he would be welcomed as a friend of the Zentaran people. The day before his departure, Kira came to see him. She was one of the 9 confirmed pregnancies. She told him that she wanted him to know he was going to be a father. Kyle did not know what to say. Kira seemed to understand his confusion. She told him that she did not expect anything from him. The child would be raised as a Zentaran with full rights and privileges in their society. But she wanted him to know that he had given her something precious, a chance to be a mother, and to contribute to the survival of her people. She handed him a small data chip and told him it contained images and information about Zentaran child development. If he ever wanted to know about his child's progress, he could contact the Zentaran embassy in human space and they would provide updates. Kyle took the chip with trembling hands. The transport ship that carried him back to human space was comfortable and well-appointed. The Zentaran crew treated him with respect and courtesy when they reached the border of human-controlled space. A human military vessel was waiting to receive him. Kyle transferred ships and found himself surrounded by human faces and human voices for the first time in months. The military debriefing took days. Kyle told them everything about his capture, the Tribunal, and the reproduction program. He could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of his debriefers. They asked him the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, as if trying to catch him in a lie. Finally, they seemed satisfied that he was telling the truth. Kyle was given an honorable discharge from the military with full benefits. He was also required to sign multiple non-disclosure agreements about his experiences on Zentara Prime. The military did not want the general public to know about the reproduction program. It was deemed too sensitive and potentially embarrassing for both human and Zentaran governments. Kyle went home to Colorado. His parents cried when they saw Him and his sister hugged him so hard he thought his ribs might crack. They wanted to know everything that had happened to him, but Kyle found that he could not tell them the whole truth. He gave them a sanitized version that left out most of the important details. Life slowly returned to something approaching normal. Kyle got a job working as a security consultant for a private company. He rented a small apartment in Denver and tried to rebuild his civilian life. But he thought about Zentara Prime constantly. He thought about Kira and Zara and Nyla and all the other women he had known for such brief, intense periods. He wondered about the children who would be born from the program. Would they look more human or more Zentaran? Would they be accepted in Zentaran society, or would they be outcasts? Would they ever want to know about their human father? 6 months after his return to Earth, Kyle received a message through official diplomatic channels. It was from Kira. She had given birth to a healthy daughter. The child had been named Kira in honor of both her parents. Kira had attached several images to the message. Kyle stared at the pictures for hours. The baby looked remarkably human, with only subtle hints of her Zentaran heritage in the slightly larger eyes and the faint silver undertones in her skin. She was beautiful. Kira's message included an invitation. If Kyle ever wanted to meet his daughter, he would be welcome to visit Zentara Prime. The Zentaran government had granted him permanent visitation rights. Kyle did not respond immediately. He spent weeks thinking about what he wanted to do. On one hand, he had already decided to move forward with his life on Earth. He had a job and an apartment, and he was reconnecting with his family and friends. Going back to Zentara Prime would complicate everything. On the other hand, he had a daughter on an alien world, a child who would grow up never knowing her father unless he made the effort to be part of her life. In the end, the decision was easier than he expected. Kyle contacted the Zentaran embassy and requested transport to Zentara Prime. When he arrived, Kira was waiting for him at the spaceport with baby Kira in her arms. Kyle held his daughter for the first time and felt something inside him shift into place. He did not know what the future would hold. He did not know if he would split his time between Earth and Zentara Prime, or if he would eventually choose one world over the other. But he knew that he had to try. He had to be there for his child, even if it meant navigating two completely different cultures and societies. Kira smiled at him with understanding in her violet eyes. She told him that they would figure it out together, and for the first time since his capture, Kyle felt like maybe everything would be okay. The years that followed were complicated and challenging. Kyle established a pattern of spending 3 months on Zentara Prime, followed by 3 months on Earth. He watched Kira grow from an infant into a toddler and then into a curious and intelligent young child. She had inherited traits from both her parents. She had Kyle's brown hair and Kira's violet eyes. She had human emotional expressiveness and Zentaran physical grace. She was unique in a way that neither species had ever seen before. The other children from the program were similar. Each one was a blend of human and Zentaran characteristics. The Zentaran scientists studied them carefully, but also allowed them to grow up as normally as possible. Kyle became friends with several of the other volunteers from the program. Zara had given birth to twin boys, who had their father's hazel eyes. Nyla had a daughter with the most remarkable silver hair Kyle had ever seen. The children all knew each other and played together regularly. They formed their own small community within Zentaran society. Kyle also learned that his participation in the program had changed his status in both human and Zentaran societies. He was no longer just a soldier who had been captured and convicted. He had become something more complex and difficult to categorize, a bridge between two species, a father to hybrid children who represented hope for the future. On Earth, he was viewed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some people saw him as a hero who had sacrificed himself to help an alien species survive. Others saw him as a traitor who had collaborated with the enemy. Kyle tried not to pay attention to either perspective. He focused on his daughter and on building relationships with the other families connected to the program. On Zentara Prime, he was welcomed and respected. The reproduction program had been deemed a success, and plans were already underway to expand it with volunteers from other human colonies. Kyle was frequently asked to speak to groups of Zentaran females who were considering volunteering for the expanded program. He tried to be honest about the challenges, while also highlighting the rewards. When Kyra turned 5 years old, she asked Kyle why she looked different from other Zentaran children. It was the question he had been dreading. Kira was there when it happened, and she squeezed Kyle's hand encouragingly. Together, they explained to Kira that she was special. She had a human father and a Zentaran mother, which made her unique. Kira thought about this for a moment, and then asked if that meant she was better than other children. Kyle laughed and told her that it did not make her better or worse. It just made her different, and being different was not a bad thing. Kira seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to playing with her toys. Kyle and Kira exchanged looks of relief. They knew there would be many more difficult conversations in the future, but they had successfully navigated this first one. As the years passed, Kyle found himself thinking less about the circumstances that had brought him to Zentara Prime, and more about the life he had built there. He had never expected to become a father or to fall in love with an alien woman, but somehow both of those things had happened. He and Kira had developed a deep partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They had never formally married according to either human or Zentaran customs, but they lived together when Kyle was on Zentara Prime, and they raised Kira as a team. Kyle also maintained his relationships on Earth. He visited his parents and sister regularly, and he had even started dating a human woman named Claire, who worked as a teacher in Denver. Claire knew about his complicated situation, and she accepted it with remarkable grace. She understood that Kyle's heart was divided between two worlds, and she did not ask him to choose. The arrangement was unconventional, but it worked for everyone involved. When Kira turned 10, she asked if she could visit Earth. Kyle and Kira discussed it at length before agreeing. The trip was carefully planned with diplomatic oversight from both human and Zentaran governments. Kyra was fascinated by everything she saw on Earth. She loved the snow-covered mountains of Colorado that Kyle had described to Zara so many years ago. She was amazed by the diversity of human cultures and the chaotic energy of human cities. She asked a million questions, and Kyle did his best to answer them all before they returned to Zentara Prime. Kira told Kyle that she wanted to learn more about both sides of her heritage. She wanted to understand what it meant to be human and what it meant to be Zentaran. She wanted to be able to move between both worlds with confidence. Kyle promised her that he would help her with that. Looking back on everything that had happened, Kyle realized that his conviction by the Zentaran Tribunal had been both the worst and the best thing that had ever happened to him. It had stripped away his freedom and forced him into an impossible situation, but it had also given him a daughter and a purpose that he never would have found otherwise. He had become part of something larger than himself. He had helped bridge the gap between two species and had contributed to the survival of the Zentaran people, and in the process he had found a family and a home in the most unexpected place. Kyle stood at the windows of his quarters on Zentara Prime, watching the 3 moons rise over the crystalline spires. Kyra was asleep in her room, and Kira was working late at the educational institute where she now taught. The city was peaceful and beautiful in the moonlight. Kyle thought about the choice he had made all those years ago in the tribunal chamber. He had chosen survival over death and participation over resistance. At the time, it had felt like he had no real choice at all. But now he understood that every choice he had made since then had led him to this moment. He was not the same man who had been captured by that Zentaran patrol. He had been transformed by his experiences and by the relationships he had built. He was a father and a partner and a bridge between worlds, and somehow, despite everything, that was enough.